Всім доброго дня. У нас триває наш онлайн блекаутний курс «Як ми загадуватимемо». Мене звати Ольга Гончар, я кураторка курсу, і сьогодні дуже щаслива представити вам матеріали наших колег з музею 911 про 11 вересня теракт в Нью-Йорку. Ми, власне, мали радість розпочати співпрацю з цим музеєм. Колеги максимально підготували матеріали для нас, де розповідають, як він створювався, як вони працюють з трагедією, з пам'яттю про трагедію, власне, з тими, хто постраждав, з їхніми родинами, і як працювати в музеї однієї трагедії, коли у світі кожен день відбуваються трагедії. Тому всіх запрошую до перегляду і гарного вам навчання. Дякую.
Greetings to everybody from New York City, to all of you who have managed to access this presentation we've developed for the Ukraine Museum Crisis Center. The historical crisis that anchors our remarks actually happened 21 years ago, about 4,500 miles removed from the active war conditions you are now navigating. But we're nonetheless honored to have an opportunity to share some of our experiences and thoughts as curators and conservators and stewards of the material heritage of 9/11, which was born from a crisis that defined the start of the current century. Our presentation is structured into two parts. The first will be an illustrated talk about the creation of the National September 11th Memorial and Museum and some of the challenges that accompanied this journey. My voice will be your guide in my role as the museum's first and now continuing chief curator. My name is Jan Seidler Ramirez. Part two will enlist more informal perspectives from my colleagues, Lisa Conte and Gareth Traeger, each of whom has held the role of head of conservation at the museum. And in many respects, they have inherited some of the issues that were never recognized or addressed as the museum collection was being formed. Holdings, I might add, that continue to grow just as the impact of 9/11 continues to reverberate in New York, in the United States, and in the world at large. I know I speak for all of our staff and leadership here in saluting your dedication, your resolve, and your resourcefulness as museum workers, which is really very inspirational to us. And we hope that much sooner than later, you'll be in a post-crisis situation and may even have the opportunity to travel and visit with us in New York. We've included our contact information, and we really do encourage you to reach out if you can. So, on to our presentation. Okay. First and foremost, I want to say that the need or imperative for a permanent public memorial preceded the need for an interpretive museum. A memorial was needed to acknowledge what happened at this place and to the larger country on 9/11 and at what human cost. This was realized through an international competition that generated well over 5,000 submissions. The final design choice, which was very solemn and stunning in scale, was an entry called Reflected Absence by a young architect named Michael Arad, which was dedicated on the 10th anniversary of the attacks in 2011. The memorial, you're seeing the South Pool here on the screen, occupies half of the 16-acre superblock of the original World Trade Center, which consisted of 7 buildings, a transit center, a shopping center, a garage, and related infrastructure, virtually all of which was destroyed on September 11th. The memorial pairs an intentionally flat horizontal plaza, which is landscaped with oak trees, devoid of any verticality of the original towers, with two immense inverted reflecting pools situated on the respective footprints of the north and the south tower, each offering waterfalls that plunge 30 feet down before disappearing into a central void or a heart, symbolic of the loss that really can't be fathomed. And edging the parapets of the pools are the individual names of the victims, consisting of 3,000 men, women, and children who ranged in age from 2 to 85 and represented 90 different nationalities. Over the years, their families and friends have developed the ritual of leaving fresh flowers and notes and other small tokens in the hollows of their loved ones' names, usually during the anniversary ceremonies marking their death, and on their birthdays and sometimes other special occasions. I think it's important to note, because the 30th anniversary of this event is soon upon us, that the memorial includes the names of 6 people who were killed at the World Trade Center on February 26, 1993, one of whom was a pregnant woman about to take maternity leave from her job. And this was the act of a forerunner terrorist cell that had left a van packed with explosives in the garage underneath the North Tower. They were hoping to topple the tower and really destroy the complex. The building, however, withstood the bomb, but the impact not only killed those in the immediate area of the blast, but also injured thousands of others and caused massive property damage. 8 years later, a group of like-minded Islamist radicals funded by al-Qaeda returned to finish the job. Our audience demographics today reveal that almost half of the museum's visitors have no lived memory of the 2001 attacks, certainly not the precursor bombing, because they were too young or they were not yet born. And thus, to launch their museum journey, we always try to rewind them back to the fateful date that is commemorated in our organizational title, recalling, as many of us do, who then lived in or were traveling through the eastern seaboard of the United States, that September 11th dawned as a very promising, very busy, early fall day in New York City. In New York City, a primary election was just underway. Polling sites were open, and many residents were stopping en route to work to exercise their democratic right to vote, a fact that actually ended up sparing lives on later that morning. The morning is really particularly remembered for its cloudless blue sky. Heavy thunderstorms had rolled through the region the previous night, producing unlimited visibility by daybreak on Tuesday. Ironically, this produced ideal flying weather, a lucky break for the hijacker teams who boarded 4 commercial passenger jets and then weaponized them to crash into high-value targets, holding status as iconic American landmarks. Their campaign began with the strikes on the quarter-mile-high Twin Towers in Lower Manhattan. Whether you liked or disliked the architecture, and there have been many debates about that, this pair of buildings served as a finding aid in the skyline. It was our sort of orienting GPS system for the entire New York, New Jersey metropolitan region. Within a span of 17 minutes that morning, both towers had been hit, were engulfed in flames, had trapped several thousand occupants from the option of safe exit. And tragically, by 10:30 in the morning, both had collapsed, creating a vast mountain of dangerous wreckage. The Twin Towers were not the exclusive targets, however, as you'll remember. The plot involved two other hijacked planes, one that managed to explode into the Pentagon, the fortress of US military might, and a fourth jetliner, which also reversed its assigned flight path that morning to speed toward Washington, D.C., but fell short of its destination. Information its passengers and flight crew gained through phone calls to and from the ground had alerted them to the other airborne assaults. And so collectively, they mounted a counterattack to try to seize control of the cockpit. The effort proved too late, unfortunately, and the plane crashed into a remote field about 175 miles west of its intended target. And authorities believe that the target was the US Capitol building, which was then hosting a joint session of the United States Congress. Had Flight 93 reached its destination, the National September 11th Memorial and Museum would probably not be located in Lower Manhattan, and very likely the resulting memorial would have been funded fully by our federal government, which is not the case of what was built in New York, which exists as a private, not-for-profit institution. As the plotters intended, September 11th and the attacks produced an awful telegenic spectacle captured on practically every form of camera or digital imaging device then in use, except, I might add, the cameras that are in our built into our smartphones, which actually were not sold commercially in the US until early 2002. These shocking images were then transmitted around the world at lightning speed, enabling an estimated 2 billion people to witness what was happening in New York City in real time. Those at or near the World Trade Center also experienced a full sensory trauma registered through the chemistry of sound and taste and touch and smell, in addition to their disbelieving eyes. With the benefit of hindsight, beyond the inconceivable violence of this singular morning, there actually were no further sustained attacks by al-Qaeda in this country. At the time, however, fear and anxiety abounded, as did widespread distress that our own government and airlines industry had failed to anticipate and prevent such an atrocity. A changed national mood took hold, which the media dubbed, quote, the new normal. Many of us thought it was the new abnormal because it arrived with novel sights, such as soldiers and gunmen patrolling our transportation hubs and landmarks, color-coded daily terrorist threats, alerting everyday people to the threats that might exist in our bigger cities. There was a run on military gas masks to ward off an actual anthrax attack, and then the fear of potential new biochemical attacks. It was a very unsettling, unnerving time. Debates also soon erupted over the trade-offs between heightened homeland security at the expense of civil liberties, particularly our long-held protections of privacy and freedom from discrimination. Controversies also quickly loomed over the inevitable political reaction to the 9/11 attacks, which was so visibly associated with the huge crater hole punched into New York City, a crater hole that had crippled the country's financial center and heart, not to mention the nearby residential and business communities and transportation systems crisscrossing through it. War on Terror, the International War on Terror, was declared 1 month after 9/11 and escalated globally, fought in places far removed from this battlefield in Lower Manhattan, a war that, as of a year and a half ago, had cost this country $8 trillion and resulted in around 90,000 deaths. Locally, there were also disputes very quickly over how to repair and best renew this pit once the rescue, recovery, and cleanup efforts had concluded. And that gargantuan task was completed in 9 months. Almost from the outset, public sentiment had insisted that space be reserved on this authentic site for a memorial to 9/11 victims. Not part of the redevelopment scheme, however, was a placeholder for a museum associated with this raw and still very new history. That idea emerged as a latecomer, with project planning initiated in 2006. On the screen, you see some of the early cutaway plans for the museum. And there were a number of conditions imposed on this museum on top of its delayed start. Number one was that, with the exception of the 2-story high entry pavilion, the building that you see there towards the north, which contains an auditorium, security screening, a cafe, and a private space overlooking the pools and trees of the plaza that's reserved for victims' relatives. The majority of this museum would need to reside underground, with the outdoor memorial serving as its roof, and with its future galleries located 70 feet below the street at what is called bedrock level, where human construction meets the deep rock at the base, the tip of Manhattan Island. Another condition was that within the eccentric contours of this space, public access would need to be given to various archaeological vestiges of the original World Trade Center, which had recently received protected status under national landmark preservation law. These, we call them in situ remnants, included a very large section of the distressed retainer wall that had been built in the 1960s as a reverse bathtub to keep the nearby water of the Hudson River from flooding the construction and excavation site, and several remnants of the outer steel box columns that had marked the original perimeter of the 2 skyscrapers you see both reflected in these views in the museum today. A solution also had to be engineered to disguise the 2 new giant boxes containing the pool mechanics, which thrust down into this cavity. Now they are camouflaged, and you can see this on the right image, with a foamed aluminum skin intended to recall the original silvery tone of the tower cladding. And underneath the pools, we were able to create 2 large, more contained gallery zones to the north and to the south, offering higher levels of climate and humidity controls that could ever be achieved in the outer envelope. These terms of engagement for delivering a museum underground produced an archaeological container that many have experienced as a powerful relic unto itself, a space that manages to register both the dualities of absence and of presence. It's a very, very distinctive experience. Despite the valiant and painstaking search for bodies and remains during the 9 months of recovery at Ground Zero, when the site was finally cleared for rebuilding, over 50% of the World Trade Center victims had never been found, nor had fragments of them ever been identified through confirmed DNA or other post-mortem evidence. This predicament of denied burial vastly complicated the grieving process of their loved ones and prolonged their search for closure, which is a term, by the way, we never use at the 9/11 Museum. An extraordinary pledge was made to the families by New York City's chief medical examiner. First, that the efforts to identify thousands of Trade Center related remains in custody of the city's overwhelmed temporary morgue would continue for as long as it might take, awaiting any new scientific methods that might be developed. And second, at such a time that a permanent memorial would be readied, these unidentified, unclaimed remains would be relocated to a new custom-built repository within the museum and memorial space. And it is today now located behind this long wall, located between the two tower volumes at Bedrock. The facility is naturally off view. Access is restricted only to the forensic coroner teams who continue these investigations. And their investigations have resulted in occasional positive notifications to families. The presence of the repository, nonetheless, is deeply felt. And it has guided the sensitivities the museum now respects around decorum, tone, and the very tricky business of acknowledging perpetrators at the crime scene, which is also an unplanned cemetery. You see on the wall there an inscription from Virgil, "No day shall erase you from the memory of time," and an art installation we commissioned from a Brooklyn-based artist, Spencer Finch, treated as a series of 2,983 individually painted blue tiles, commemorating sort of the different ways and different gradations of human memory of that blue September sky. Another mission assigned to this new museum was to build an encyclopedic collection across all media and formats centered around the two attacks that happened here and their consequences. This effort was going to be undertaken as a tribute to the victims and as a service to future humanity trying to understand this pivotal crisis and event that launched the 20th century and has continued to influence it. I will say that the efforts begun in 2006 would not have been achievable without the blood, sweat, and tears and grit of a group of museum professionals, mostly in New York, who came together in the early aftermath period to volunteer their time, their gut instincts, and their professional expertise to work collaboratively as a single strong voice on behalf of history, advocating for the preservation of evidence of what happened, to whom it happened, and where it happened, and much more difficult to unpack at the time, why it happened, given our sort of limited abilities. And our abilities at the time were also very limited as to what we could tag and try to safeguard for museum preservation. There was an active criminal investigation happening. Here you see pictures of some of us. I happen to be the person in the terrible pants on the left, and one of my colleagues here at the museum today, Amy Weinstein, is the woman in white there on the right. We tried what we could do. We're here shown at the Fresh Kills landfill, which is where the authorities set up a restricted operation to search for human remains, for criminal evidence, for personal effects, and for property that could possibly be restored to the tenants of the towers. The site was a recently closed garbage dump And it was really a terrible place to have to work. And many hundreds of teams from across the United States, FBI, Salvation Army, FEMA came to this site to do this work. One thing this new museum did have, however, was a unique resource we inherited for First Choice from the Port Authority of New York, New Jersey. And these were physical relics from the World Trade Center site that they had established and brought to an empty hangar facility at JFK Airport. Within it, there was sheltered several thousand artifacts and property elements pulled out of Ground Zero and from the Staten Island recovery operations by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. And because that agency may not be familiar to you, it's the bi-state agency that operates the New York region's airports and tunnels and bridge crossings. And it's also the agency that actually built and operated the World Trade Center until its catastrophic demise and lost almost 60 of their own employees. Although the majority of materials stored there had not been documented or cataloged, the hangar did, we could see right away, offer up some of the most resonant witness items from 9/11. This includes the incredible, a small fleet of rescue vehicles that had suffered brute force wounds and damage as a result of the catastrophic building collapses. And then a number of huge multi-ton pieces of torn steel, some of them twisted and scorched as a result of the airplane impacts or bent by the physics of the pancaking towers, floors falling on top of floors, gaining weight as the loads sank. The intrinsic drama, really, of these huge objects posed questions immediately for our project team, for our curators and our collection managers and exhibit designers. How were we going to safely install and present these heavy, monumental, and telegraphic objects like this segment of steel splayed by the force of the first hijacked plane cutting into the North Tower? How were we going to display it without presenting it as an aesthetic sculpture? And how were we going to display it within a setting that also had to give presence to the intimate workings of terrorism? For instance, the far smaller and more humble and quietly injured objects that are surrogates for people, everyday people caught in this vortex. Items like recovered plastic ID badges, prosaic, except for the circumstances of their provenance, of where they were found, and the reality that the individuals depicted on them may not have survived or ever have been found in the rubble. In our memorial museum, the arithmetic of human loss is big, but should never be an abstraction. Today, the museum's memorial exhibition, located on the South Tower footprint, is where each life is recognized as irreplaceable, each death as upending a small universe of relationships, and each of the 2,983 names and faces you see on the wall, which are there to evoke the magnitude and the diversity of these casualties. Every name and every face will have a chance to be remembered with stories and with contributions, including recovered personal effects shared with the museum by their next of kin and their friends and their coworkers. One so memorialized now is Alex Brzezinski, who had immigrated to New York City from Odessa in the early 1990s to pursue his dream career in finance and at Reuters, and was doing so until fate intervened and brought him to a technology conference, unfortunately, held at the top of the North Tower on the morning of September 11th. As the collection was being rapidly assembled to serve the museum's opening exhibitions, we concentrated first and foremost on capturing the narratives, the personal narratives attached to the materials that donors came to us with, most often tied to their ordeals as survivors or bereaved relatives, or as responders, Ground Zero recovery workers, downtown residents, volunteers, and members of the military. We saw the dust and collapsed residues embedded in these objects and articles of clothing as affidavits of the truth of their experience. Only later did we gain time and understanding to start to craft a set of procedures for handling and housing and showing these items, like the shoes. Our posture today is these items are now guilty until proven innocent. These dust-implicated objects have to be marked as harboring contaminants of potential concern because of their exposure to the toxins released when the towers crumbled and from the caustic smoke and fires that burned at Ground Zero for months thereafter. The training for collection professionals now, of course, includes awareness of conservation techniques for restoring damage to objects. For us, however, preserving that damage, the authenticity of the wounds and the blisters and the soiling that is so important to these witness artifacts has become our own emerging practice of collection stewardship, a topic of discussion that we'll be taking up in part 2 of this presentation. The condition of these 2 examples of the remains of the day offer wordless evidence of what happened to the first responders associated with them at the World Trade Center. At left, you see the decapitated Ladder 3 truck as it now reposes near the threshold to the museum's primary historical exhibition, a truck that memorializes the courage of the specific 11 firefighters who rode the rig downtown that morning and never returned to it. But it also acknowledges the 343 line of duty deaths sustained by the city's fire department, a loss comparable to the sudden erasure of 4,400 years of aggregate expertise. The battered helmet on the right is a reminder that rank made no difference when the inconceivable happened, not once, but twice that morning. Probationary firefighters who were new to the job perished alongside their senior commanders and the department's most decorated, experienced chiefs. I did want to put in one slide as a placeholder to note that the majority of our collection actually does not date to the catastrophe of the day itself, but actually reflects what followed from September 12th forward. The wave, the outpouring of humanitarian response, the way obstacles were surmounted, the myriad tributes that were paid to victims and to the thousands who risked their lives to help and contribute to the aftermath. We know that visitors require uplift. They require encountering materials that enable them to find hope and pride in the reality that evil and anger and dread did not end up defining us. It was transcendent kindness and generosity. So what have we learned since the dedication and official opening of the museum, which happened in May of 2014? You see the special guest on the screen who came to help us open the museum. For one thing, we have been absolutely amazed by the hybrid power of this authentic site. of the memorial and museum as a place. The public at large, including visitors from overseas and our own stakeholders who are part of the history we commemorate, they have come in significant numbers to pay their respects and to learn. Factoring in months of closure during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, almost 61 million people have now visited the outdoor memorial, and another 20 million have elected to experience the museum, which, as you know now, opened some years later. A lot of evolving practical skills also had to develop in order to accommodate this volume of guests and make sure that their visiting experience remained as meaningful as possible. So, some of the big lessons or big ideas. Increasingly, we are welcoming members of the successor generation, as I mentioned earlier, people born after or too young to have their own memories of 9/11, but who have inherited their consequences. So education has become a paramount activity delivered through expanded school programs, teacher training, lesson plans, and activities developed for youth and family audiences. What does a young person think when they encounter the phrase and promise, never forget? What do we think they should know? What do they want to know? So this is one of the big questions that animates our work. We have also found that the Memorial Museum has met a need, a deep felt need, for an inclusive place that promotes healing and reflection. And this was exampled during the All Faith prayer meeting that Pope Francis conducted at the museum in 2015. After acknowledging the pain and destruction of 9/11, he also spoke about the bravery and the compassion and the resilience demonstrated in this very same place. He reminded attendees that the values connecting us as human beings form a far stronger bond than our differences, be they spiritual beliefs or languages or country of origin or skin color and so forth. The museum and memorial is also serving as a catalyst for connection. But one example, increasingly, we are welcoming incoming classes of civil service recruits and connecting them to the living histories of their particular first responder or public protection or investigative agencies, making them aware of how their work is connected to or emerges out of 9/11. Coming to the 9/11 Museum is now mandatory for all FBI trainees and for all probationary members of the New York City Fire Department and Police Department. And with the fire department in particular, many of the young recruits we are seeing had a parent or an uncle or an aunt who died at ground zero or from a related 9/11 condition. The memorial in particular has become a place where we can salute the service of those who fought in the prolonged and costly war on terror. We've actually posted re-enlistment ceremonies on the plaza. And every Veterans Day in November, we honor 9/11 victims who themselves had been military victims. And you see some of our volunteers placing yellow roses on their name. And finally, we recognize here that the past is never over. It's still very much present. 9/11's impact isn't over, nor is our understanding of these events complete. The suspected co-conspirators and enablers still detained at Guantanamo have yet to be tried. Justice has not been served. 40% of the 9/11 victims still elude medical identification. And in New York City, as just one sampling area, acts of terror, often by radicalized lone wolf actors, continue to plague us. These assaults have been less audacious than the 9/11 plot, but nonetheless, they disrupt our sense of security and they have inflicted mortal harm on innocent bystanders. In May of 2019, we actually modified the design of the outdoor memorial to include a special glade, a new landscaped area with these boulders, specifically to recognize 9/11 recovery workers and survivors who have succumbed to illnesses triggered by their exposure to toxins from the disintegrated buildings. These collateral environmental crisis deaths have now recently outnumbered the totality of names around the memorial pools. And finally, redemptive endings have eluded us. They will always elude us, which isn't to say the ground zero's nearly 2 million tons of wreckage hadn't been cleared. The site was repaired, and the lower Manhattan area where the Twin Towers once stood has been reclaimed. It has been restored as a vibrant neighborhood, boasting a new skyline and a single new dominant tower. It's a place where hope and memory commingle. And as we struggled to find, the ending for the 9/11 Memorial Museum and our historical exhibition, we began to think we didn't need to ourselves author one. People exiting the 9/11 Museum would come out to the plaza and they would see what the city itself, what the nation itself had done to move forward. And that seems to be a great message to hold on to if we can look forward and not get too caught in our present day circumstances. So with that, we'll end the slides and you'll have the opportunity to hear a more informal conversation among our conservators and the curator in a second session. Welcome, everybody. This is the 9/11 Memorial Museum, Part 2, a much more informal conversation with me. I'm Jan Ramirez. I'm the chief curator at the museum and have been with this project from the beginning, and also the executive vice president of collections. And I'm joined in this conversation by two colleagues who I can honestly say are two of the best professionals I've ever worked with, who are respectively the head of conservation and then the new head of conservation. And they are beginning to really think through some of the implications of the collecting we've been doing for these many years. And we're also joined by Dylan Williams, who has just relatively newly come to the staff as our curatorial assistant. He's a historian, and he is also the generation, we often say, rather young, and wouldn't have had too many of powerful memories from the day, because I believe you were in elementary school, Dylan. Mm-hmm. So we will keep this informal, and I thought we'd have each of our colleagues introduce themselves to you. So maybe Kareth, you're next.
Yeah. I'm Kareth Schrager. I'm the current head of conservation here at the 9/11 Memorial and Museum. My specialty is in objects conservation. However, I also work with museums on handling hazardous collection materials, which is part of our collection policy here at the museum. And I'll let Lisa go next.
Hi, it's nice to meet everybody, and thank you for joining us for this conversation. My name is Lisa Conti, and currently I am the visiting associate professor of paper conservation at the Conservation Center of the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University. Prior to this role, which I started in September of 2022, I was at the 9/11 Memorial Museum for about 5.5 years, working with the collection that Jan spoke to you about earlier.
And again, I'm Dylan Williams. I'm the new curatorial assistant here at the 9/11 Museum. Coming from a background of historic preservation, I just finished my master's degree studying historic sites and how they are related to the making of memory and historical memory. So I thought to start off this conversation, Jan, maybe you could, cue us off talking a little bit about the initial intake process of bringing in some of the artifacts that came into the museum in the earliest years of collecting.
Sure. As I mentioned in our previous session, I was part of this informal group of second responders. We called ourselves the Museum Consortium. We came together within 2 weeks after the 9/11 attacks because we all wanted to do something useful to help, and we couldn't donate blood. They weren't taking blood. We couldn't operate backhoes. We couldn't, didn't have trained search and rescue dogs. I mean, what could we do? And I think we had our mindset had to get to the point of recognizing ourselves as agents on behalf of history, even if we didn't understand what we were looking at most of the time. And every institution in the consortium participated in some way by either releasing our staff time, contributing funds for transit and storage of materials to bring them in out of the bad weather or give them a safe harbor. They talked to their trustees. They talked to elected officials to try to raise money to cover the cost of this kind of informal rescue mission. And most particularly, we had to figure out how to do this without getting in the way of a major international criminal investigation and aviation incident investigation. So part of it was to introduce what museums did to the people we were meeting from the FBI and from the federal aviation industry and the New York City police officers and the other, many, many different investigators who were rather charming in a terrible time otherwise, by just deciding to call us the museum. They couldn't, keep up with the distinctions between our different institutional names and places. And that actually came to feel very good. We were all in it together on behalf of, a museum of the future.
Jan, do you remember the first artifact that you collected or that somebody gave to you because, they thought it had particular import in that moment? And can you maybe share why, what the thinking was around that?
I certainly remember it because I was in New York City at the time. I was at a different cultural institution, which turned out to be safely uptown. It wasn't down where the attacks were occurring. And we were in lockdown because bomb threats had been called into our building, so no one was moving. And around 2:30 in the afternoon, one of my coworkers who had not heard from her husband, who lived downtown, and she was, enormously concerned about his welfare and couldn't get through because the phone lines were down on top of everything else. There was the bell rang, and we had to get our security team to come and make sure, the person coming into the building was, a good person, not somebody that meant us harm. And it turned out to be her husband, who was coated in dust. He'd walked up many miles north and from the stricken area around Ground Zero, as they were beginning to call it at that point in the afternoon. And he put on my desk a dust mask that his building concierge had handed to him as he went out in his pajama bottoms to begin this walk. And he said to me, "I don't know what this means, but someday it may mean something." And here we are 21 years later, and the dust itself from 9/11 is an artifact, and it is both something, as we often say, very dear, because it has the mortal essence of people who were never found. And it is also something people have rightly come to fear because of the sort of witch's brew of contaminants that we now know were also associated with this dust. So that was the first artifact.
Well, thinking that you were in a museum on 9/11 and, we're already very much thinking about the preservation of history. I wonder if Dylan and Kareth, if you might want to share, your experience that day, just to maybe contextualize, how we all look at, this event very individually.
Yeah, so I was a recent graduate of Boston University, and I was living in Boston at the time. So it really was, a transition in my life from, becoming an adult, and also we had this great shift in how we as a country were living. I'm a little bit more disconnected, I think, than people who lived in New York. I, again, was old enough to understand what was happening, but it affected Boston in a way because the flights came out of Boston, but it wasn't nearly as devastating as I think it was in New York. And I thought Jan's discussion of this mask that she got is a really great way for us to sort of introduce our very robust hazardous materials policy that we have here at the museum. Anything that was recovered from ground zero is considered hazardous material. We call it contaminants of potential concern. And it was very forward thinking of the people who created this policy at the time, because we did know that this was hazardous material, that we needed to treat these objects with care and protect the workers that were going to be handling them in the future. So we do have a very in-depth policy on how we are required to handle these objects. We have to wear personal protective equipment and make sure that they are cleared to be in exhibition spaces where the public will also be exposed to them.
If you don't mind, I'll just add that this was a latecomer awareness of the potential toxicity associated with these artifacts, because I can certainly remember in the earliest days and weeks getting cleared to come down to the World Trade Center site. First of all, to walk around, they did give me a mask, but actually being handed, along with a colleague of mine, some of an odd section of window blind that was fluttering in a nearby tree in the churchyard near the World Trade Center, St. Paul's Chapel churchyard. And my colleague was very intrigued by it because he recognized that it had, come from one of the 40,000 windows in the World Trade Center. This was all that was left. It was, fluttering there. And we ended up walking a few blocks and getting on one of the public subways to go back north, holding this object, as people were coming onto the subway and getting off. I think what we didn't know was really profound at the time. We were all working on adrenaline. There was really no such thing as best practices around this. And there was no real habit of, what we now call rapid response collecting. We were just going on our, gut instincts to move as quickly as we could to be of service, to help save things, and also bring things in out of the rain and out of the weather. And this coincided over the fall with the gradual shrinking back in New York of these temporary we call them the grassroots shrines, the places that the general public could reach to come and grieve people that they may not have even known, but, to leave flowers and candles and notes and the missing person flyers and trinkets and items that they felt would be meaningful. And a lot of that material came in to these institutions as well, with absolutely no particular provenance associated with them, except that it came from, a shrine in Union Square, or it came from a shrine in Grand Central train station.
Where were the things initially stored that you took in? And was that storage location centralized amongst the consortium of different museum practitioners that were participating in this effort?
There was absolutely there was no real rationale to where things were ending up. We had one particular partner museum, the New York State Museum, which is located in New York's capital, which is, about 150 miles north of here. They had warehouses and they were willing, they had vans, so they were taking some things up there. I would say every museum in the metro area that was involved started simply filling closets, filling their collection storerooms. And interestingly, it was conservators who were on staff and collection managers who were sort of putting their hands up and saying, wait, where has this come from? Do you have any paperwork associated with this? And it was really the curators and historians who were saying, we'll have to catch up with that later. The most important thing is to get it out of harm's way, because if we don't bring it in, it's going to be disposed of or destroyed by the weather.
I'd love to hear Dylan's perspective on what having an organization like this available to him as someone who doesn't have a direct connection to the experience of 9/11 and sort of having this established for the next generation as we sort of approach now the 25th anniversary.
Sure, yeah. So I mean, a little bit about my background. I was 6 on 9/11. And I grew up in Los Angeles, so on the exact opposite coast, opposite side of the country of the continental US as New York City and DC and these impacted communities. So I was very much physically removed from the events of that day. But, you know, through just chance, I grew up with parents that worked in the airline industry. I was a frequent flyer growing up. And so I very much learned about 9/11 and the aftermath through the changes to the airline industry. And then obviously how, you know, it impacted the world afterwards. You know, many of my friends are the young people that would eventually enlist in the military and go and fight these wars in the Middle East in the aftermath of 9/11. And so being at an institution like this, it's very interesting to work with people like Jan, who were, you know, at the forefront of collecting, you know, in the very early days, and were probably concerned with a very select set of questions and, you know, a certain historical perspective. And then now to be kind of a younger face within the organization, looking forward and having lived through and, you know, grown up in the age of, you know, xenophobia that is targeted because of, you know, these transnational events that happen like 9/11, and having to reckon with that and have more of a consciousness, like, you know, within my own generation about those issues. How do we fit that into what we're doing at the museum? You know, I've been really interested in my own studies in school about how the rise in memorial museums really came about as we started to renegotiate the relationship between history and the present, and how is that like constantly evolving? And so I think that's a really interesting question we, as like within our own institution, have to answer in the years to come.
I think you've brought up a really, really good point, Dylan, which is certainly in the West and elsewhere now, there is this new sort of genre of museum that is the memorial museum. You know, it often exists, but not always at the site of the atrocity. It exists to honor and commemorate the loss of innocent lives, to hold the perpetrators accountable for that. And it's a very sort of new and nuanced charge for curators and historians, I believe, because you are not working in a neutral place. You're where you can put on your academic hat and burrow as deeply as you might wish to into the questions, the complicated questions of why did this happen? Why did these people target us? You know, was our response appropriate? Because you're also caretaking the memories of people who cannot speak for themselves, who you may not have ever known, but you're now sort of the steward of their sacred memory in many ways. And these sites do feel sacred, even when they're not on the actual footprint. Ours happens to be. Another great example in the United States is, of course, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., which is a deep, thorough look at the impact of the Holocaust. It's certainly not on the site of a death camp. It's an ocean away. But when you leave that museum, you walk out and you see the United States Capitol, and you want to know why the country didn't do more to help save people. It's a very, you know, it also has a very special agenda to it. But the genre of memorial museum, particularly those at a site of a mass tragedy, have become sort of a new category of museums. And I'm not really sure, and my graduate training was many, many years ago, and maybe the three of you will have something to say, whether that kind of genre, the memorial museum, is something that is introduced into the curriculum for conservation or for historiography or for curation. It certainly wasn't when I was doing my work.
I think Lisa might have an interesting perspective on that because she's had a lot of time to think about damage and how we sort of preserve damage. So maybe she can talk about, you know, how she thinks about the differences of working for this kind of institution.
Well, thank you. I want to say that in both Dylan and Jan's most recent remarks, the thing that really centers them is the idea that these museums put their focus on people. And with the case of memorial museums right now, they certainly are advocating for more than just people, but they're advocating for human rights and dignity, the way that human beings are really, you know, all meant to be equal, and putting forth, you know, those ideals make it, you know, a real privilege to work with collections like these, because the work that we're doing oftentimes, while we are storytelling through artifacts, those artifacts are representing stories that are traced back to people. And so I think that in my work at the 9/11 Memorial Museum, that was one of the foundational principles, you know, that really became entrenched in my conservation philosophy. But I didn't understand that right away. I didn't understand, you know, that, you know, the scars of the objects were representing the scars of something that happened to someone, that there was something behind that. And so I think for me, in the work that I've done and have been thinking a lot about is, you know, where does, you know, those lines between history and damage, between person and object, you know, how do we reconcile those as we preserve objects going into the future? Another thing that I found particularly complicated on the subject of damage, and I know that our colleagues in the Ukraine are collecting some of those objects that are coming out of sites of destruction and war and trauma that they've all endured, is how do you look at objects and understand at what point in something's history something happened to it? And I know with the collection at the 9/11 Memorial Museum, a collection we were, you know, a topic we were talking about earlier with Jan was the idea of where were you collecting, when were you collecting? And people were bringing things to the museum, you know, that they had collected from ground zero. So what were those subjected to, those objects? They were subjected to the force of the destruction of the buildings and all that was within it. They may have been subjected to the machinery that was clearing the site. They may have been subjected to the environment, the rain, the wind, the cold. And then they may have been subjected to the next place where they were brought, which was to Fresh Kills, where Jan also was for collecting items related to the event, where there they were further handled, sorted, and returned to families before then coming back to us. And each of those people had a different way of caring for those objects, or before a period of time where they were cared for because they were outside, you know, and nobody was caring for them. So we also have to think a lot about that. And different people look at things different ways. And so while one person might say, I want this to feel more whole, another person might say, this is right just the way it is. And so that was the part that took time for me to understand, because I had to learn the stories of people to understand that you really needed a different approach a lot of times depending upon the object.
And I think as conservators, we are taught a little bit to disengage from the objects that we're working on, where I think from the curatorial side, they are taught to engage more with the personal stories. And I think, as Lisa was sort of alluding to, it's more difficult for us as conservators to sort of make that switch to understanding that the preservation priorities we might have learned in our education may not necessarily apply to these kinds of stories and these kinds of artifacts.
I'm also thinking of smell, because these artifacts in the beginning of the unfurling of 9/11, if they came from Lower Manhattan, or probably came from the Pentagon crash site, or came from Fresh Kills, there was a very distinctive odor associated with them. You can imagine the odors, including smoke and fire and other very noxious smells. And so sometimes we had people that donated to the museum because they did not want their children to come upon a sealed plastic bag that contained their loved one's scorched wallet. They didn't want the children to smell it. They wanted to get it to the museum, so we would be the ones handling the smell. On the other side, I've had family members come in, and sometimes it's a parent of an adult child who they had to, their child died. They had to come and clean out the apartment, where they would come to us and say, this was my son's sweatshirt, or this was my daughter's scarf. Please, please save the smell. The smell would be of the person's cologne or perfume, or actually their human sweat if they had been, playing basketball on Monday, September 10th. And they literally were expecting, it was sort of almost a sacred transaction where we were becoming sort of ministers, members of the clergy, taking in, these relics of, they weren't saints, but relics of people. And we were being asked to, for posterity, because the child hadn't survived, or the husband, or the wife, or the grandparent hadn't survived, to please at least protect the smell. And that has always stayed with me, because that's one thing we really haven't been able to do.
Though, I don't actually remember the name of the exhibition offhand at the moment, but Arthur Danto did do an exhibition in Lower Manhattan around the senses of the way in which artists kind of navigated their own grief or their own reactions to 9/11 shortly thereafter. And I do recall that there was one artist who, materially tried to preserve exactly what you were talking about.
Yeah. Well, and the issue of materiality is also very key to understanding, I think, the long-term trauma of 9/11, because when you think of the physicality, the number of people, the number of desks, the number of file drawers, the number of desk trophies and, personal photographs, the number of business papers, everything that was in that 7-building complex, it's just stunning to see how little of it survived in a visually recognizable form. Almost everything came back in tiny fragments. And it was, the fragmentation that the event created, I think also invested tremendous precious power in the fragment itself. And we have a whole category of items in the collection that are fragments from something. Somebody, a rescue recovery worker, picked up something they thought might have been from, an outdoor sculpture that was partially destroyed, or from a particular, signage on the building, and they didn't have the big piece. They only had a small piece, but they kept it. Sometimes they created reliquary boxes for it. And when they came in to donate it, it was a ritual. It wasn't just somebody, putting something on our desk or table and say, here, it's yours now. There was, a story that was told. There was the unveiling. There was the trembling hands that were passing, to us as custodians, something that survived, something that, remained when mostly precious people did not.
Because we're talking about, the great emotional and human toll of this event, I wonder if you would all be willing to talk about how working with this collection, the impact that it has on you as a person, and within the museum context, you know, as colleagues, you know, how we've helped each other while, you know, working with this collection and this type of material. I don't know if Dylan or Kara, perhaps you'd like to respond first.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to be a certain kind of person to want to work in this with this type of collection in the first place. So I have found that the people who work here are unusually supportive and of sort of family life and understanding when you've reached your limitations. And I think working in that kind of environment has really supported my mental health and things for having to work with this collection. You know, with my background in health and safety, I sort of came prepared with those sort of coping mechanisms to come into this space. But I feel like the museum does a very good job of supporting us, you know, from top to bottom and how we deal with these issues.
Certainly. I think as a newer staff member, I found in my very short, like 11 months, what's kept me grounded is the feeling of humble, like the humble feeling that pervades the entire institution. I think everyone has an innate sense of duty working here. And to Kara's point, I think that also enables a lot more empathy towards knowing when people have reached their mental, emotional limit when working with such heavy objects. And so that combined with, you know, the ability to, you know, again, from the curatorial side, become well acquainted with these stories, not only the stories, but the people behind them and be able to meet them. That's a really rare opportunity as a historian. I know I studied 19th century history, American history before this, and you don't get to meet the people that you're reading about or studying. And so to meet these people and have, you know, family members that are able to come and personally tell you thank you for what you're doing and how much it means to them, you know, I think that for me, that's how I kind of am able to ground myself a little bit in such content.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting because I think this is maybe to overly intellectualize it, but the 9/11 Museum, yes, of course, is about a terror attack, an unprecedented terror attack that launched the 21st century. But it's also a museum about humanity at the start of the 21st century, particularly in New York City. How did the city work? Who came here to work? You know, we know that, or the popular media tells us that there are, of course, you know, financial moguls who were in the building and lawyers and, you know, people involved with international trade, but there were so many other people here, you know, somebody on their first job to New York who may not have been documented, you know, who was unfortunately delivering an egg sandwich or a cup of coffee to the wrong office on the wrong floor at the wrong time on the wrong day. But this is the very fact that there were 90 nationalities reflected in the ultimate victim tally says something also about, I think, the United States, which is that we're not perfect, but we have been generally very fluid. People travel, they come, you enjoy liberty, you enjoy freedom. And that's one thing that 9/11 did in the immediate aftermath. I think there were those that felt, are we really going to have to turn to become a police state to keep ourselves safe? Thankfully, that didn't turn out to be the case, but it was a real deep, penetrating conversation about what does it mean to enjoy the freedom that most American citizens have. And that includes the freedom to protest and the freedom to have a point of view and express a point of view through your art, through your spoken language, through your written pieces that may be problematic to other people. But, you know, it is a deep protection of ours. And I think one thing we've tried to do in building our collection is make sure that there are as many diverse viewpoints represented as possible. And one good example would be it's not a large collection, but materials that speak to conspiracy theorists, you know, people that were handing out false literature, creating crazy videos about, you know, the inside job that 9/11 was, and T-shirts, you know, supporting that kind of thing. We do collect that material because it's part of the mix. It's It's part of what democracy is. It's the challenge of democracy, but we do collect it.
So one of the surprising things I found when I started working here was that, yes, it is a place of trauma, and yes, it is a place of remembrance. But now, as we are getting 20 years out, it is also a place of healing. It's a place of optimism to show that how we can recover and come back. That was a really eye-opening moment for me, particularly when I attended the commemoration for the first time. And I know that we are kind of running long on time here, so I thought perhaps we could finish up with each of us maybe providing some insight into what we thought maybe could have been differently or done differently, or what we would like, advice that we can give, or something along those lines. For me, since I'm new at this institution and I'm sort of getting my feet wet, understanding what's going on, I think it's really important, as they are starting to make this collection, that they understand that there is a push to start this institution, but that it's going to continue on and for hopefully decades and decades, and they need to plan the infrastructure for creating that kind of system that will live on for a long time and supporting their mission.
I would say that give up the idea of having perfect decisions. You'll never have perfect decisions. Trust your instincts both as human beings and as professionals, the professionals you are. They're usually good instincts. If you can build in time, and time might be 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line, but build in time to go back and have a second look, have a third look, have a fourth look. You're going to see different things as time goes by. You may want to winnow down and reduce, the materials that you brought in out of the cold or brought in out of the battlefield, so to speak, because you have better examples that you've been able to document. But nothing is going to happen. Nothing happens automatically. You do have to have trust that time will be revealing to you. So, eat your strongest food and coffee and just, stay with it. It's just so meaningful to so many people.
I would say that be kind to yourself and to be kind to one another's and to be an advocate for yourself, especially when it comes to safety, whether that be psychological or physical. Some of the materials that you're handling can potentially be hazardous. And so if you don't know the answer, there are plenty of professionals, I'm sure, that are, just really willing to lend their expertise. And so to reach out, your community wants to help you. On top of that, just know that the work that I think that you're doing now, you can't tell, who it's going to serve, but it's going to serve the future very meaningfully. And so in that sense, celebrate, that we're all here together now and working in this field and supporting, the preservation of history in whatever way that you can. Please, we want to be resources to you in any way possible.
Ellen?
I can't top that expertise, but, I would just say staying determined and knowing that what you are doing is in the service of generations, down the road, people like me who are able to come in, once the history has at least been preliminarily written and pick up and build off your shoulders. What you're doing is important at a foundational level. So just staying with it.
And I also think there's a joy in another otherwise very hard subject. There's a joy of almost every day is different. Almost every day, you're going to learn something you didn't know the day before. Almost every day, a colleague you didn't know particularly well will say something and you're going to connect with that. And this is what makes, it keeps you on your toes, as they say. And it makes it intellectually very rewarding, just as it is very emotionally rewarding, which doesn't mean it's easy. It's not, but it is rewarding.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. I think this was a really great discussion, and of course, our contact information will be available, and we are more than happy to discuss with anyone any of these topics further, or if you have any additional questions or comments. And as Lisa mentioned, you know, we're always here to help and help guide you in this process.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
All right.
Stay
Thank
safe.
you. Bye-bye.